The time management issue shouldn't be as big in the next 2 weeks. This is a 5-week series. But it will be huge in the 5th week. I can already see where this material goes. I'll remind you of where the material comes from. It comes from a sermon series that I taught back and delivered back in 2014. I was in my mid-60s or almost in my mid-60s. And these were reflections on what I saw of the state of spirituality, the state of the church in the world today. And I called the series New World in the Morning, and we introduced it last time. Let me get rid of this one thing that pops up here so I can see who might come on. Okay, so I'm drawing 5 sermons from this series. So I just went back a few minutes ago to see how many sermons were in the series, and I thought there were probably like 20 or 25, which would be like sort of insane, but there were 47. So I call your attention to that to remind you that this particular one was probably 7th in that series. And the way I would tend to construct those series, they build up to some extent. It probably in the series was better as the 7th than as the 2nd, but bear with me on it. What I did do is I took the keynote talk, the very first one, and then I took the 4 the concepts of which stood out to be, and that turned out to be 7, 8, 10, and 29 or something. Anyway, the concept today is belonging. And I begin with these questions, and I ask these questions rhetorically to begin with. But these are the questions that sort of open up what we're talking about tonight, this morning. What does it usually take to be considered a Christian in good standing? That's kind of the question. It's a very general question. It's not a question for legalists or purists or whatever, just generally, experientially. What does it usually take to be considered a Christian in good standing? By what kinds of standards has historic Christianity usually measured church membership, affiliation, and identity? Well, we're Church Christ, and so we measure it by whether you're baptized and baptized right. Okay, I'm not talking about that. That's that particular point will be shaped somewhat by some of the things we talked about this morning. And I don't know why I think it's night on. No, it was one of those days yesterday, right? It's already nighttime. Okay, now the point is the kinds of standards that historic Christianity is usually measured church membership, affiliation, identity. I'm talking, usually it's measured by beliefs and practice. I mean, that seems so obvious that it's just part of the air we breathe. It's beliefs and practices. You get your beliefs and practices right, you're a Christian in good standing. The fact that there are 1,000 denominations and they all have different answers to that notwithstanding. Okay, but it's beliefs and practices. What we're going to be looking at today is that's not even obvious. That's not even obvious. There's a couple of things that come in before, I think, before beliefs and practices. And we'll talk about that today. Previously on this series, we talked about we live in a time of transition, a time of great cultural, technological, and religious shifts. Old forms are dying, new ones are being born. Church attendance is in historic decline almost everywhere across church traditions in America. For a little while, the evangelicals held out, but they're not holding out. And so across all traditions in America, it's declining, as they did a few generations ago in Europe. Okay. And yet everywhere there are signs of spiritual quest. There are people asking questions they've never asked before. There are people open to possibilities they've never considered before. And in fact, it's likely that we are on the edge of a great global spiritual awakening. That was the point that I was endeavoring to make last week, and it's a point I believe in. Big picture is I'm very, very optimistic and very, very joyful about where things are, quite frankly. I mean, you know, we have to see what I'm talking about because almost nobody else is. But there's reason for optimism. There's a reason for great hope here. On the edge of a great global spiritual awakening, but not without change, and not without substantial change, and not without many, many people weighing church in the scales as it is, and finding that church comes up short. And I'm talking about across the board, And we talked about last week, and this, I think, if you think about this, you'll find it's true to your life. It's true to mine. Things are always coming together and falling apart, right? That's what's been happening in your life so far. Things are always coming together and falling apart, and then coming together again and falling apart again. Okay, and yeah. Okay, but here's the good news about falling apart. That sometimes things falling apart are exactly what needs to happen to make room for something new and better. You know, not necessarily your new needs, but they're better than your old ones just were, you know. So that's the point, that things need to fall apart. Sometimes the good news is in the falling apart. It's not in the things coming together, unless the things coming together are like really great, fantastic, and can't ever be beat forever. You know, other than that, the falling apart's often pretty good news because it makes room for options you haven't considered. It teaches you lessons you haven't learned before, and a lot of good things come from that. One big problem, and that's the one we take up today, that many people, especially many unchurched people, find troubling, and that's the whole notion of thought control in the church. That widespread notion that we must be identical in our doctrine and practice, that we must see all the mysteries of our transcendent God. Think about that. That we must see all the mysteries of our transcendent God the same way, or we cannot be in fellowship or communion with one another. And across the Christian world, you can think that, and still think that. Okay, that's what I was raised in. What numbers of people in relatively my generation, at least, were raised in. In fact, it was the promise of the 18th century Enlightenment that if all could be free to think for themselves, now catch this, that if all could be free, the promise of the 18th century Enlightenment, if all could be free to think for themselves, they would all come to think the same thing.
Right.
Right. Right. For 200 years, we have held on to that. And a lot of us still think that. I remember there was a little track when I was way back in the day, you know, can all people read the Bible alike? And to me, that was like, I mean, at that point in time, in 4 pages, they wrapped it up. What they should have been able to do is wrap it up in 1 word. No, no, historically, of course not. I mean, it's never been. I mean, you can get John and Rosemary to agree on this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Or yeah. Okay. So really, that promise of the 18th century Enlightenment doesn't really make any sense. Freedom to think for ourselves, and we'll all think the same thing. Think about your own life. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Okay, what I'm doing in terms of time management today is moving pretty quickly through the first part, hoping we get to the last three questions. Last three questions I think are pretty important. If we don't get to them with justice, then please take the sheet with you and work with them a bit yourself. Think through the implications of those questions. Okay, but here's one. If you have quick responses to this, shout them out or whatever. What are some consequences for understanding truth in this way? Consequences for the church and for life in the church. You may just be thinking about that generally. If you immediately see one or two big consequences, let me know. Don't give me a survey of church history.
No, just the concept of church divisions.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Just from the Catholic Church.
That's good. That's the survey I do not want. No, but I mean, you're absolutely
forward.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The division over and over and over again. Endless squabblings within churches. Right? We all turned into doctrinal vigilantes. I did that for. I'm worn out from that. I do not want to do that again. I'm tired of it. Every soul engaged in it is worn out from it. It's not what human souls were meant to be engaged in, really. And competing citadels of orthodoxy, each one of which is a denomination, right? That's what a denomination is a competing citadel of orthodoxy that gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That's the inevitable consequence of this kind of thinking. And what does this understanding do to our spiritual joy and vitality? I hadn't thought about that really until I guess back in the series, I must have thought about it for a moment, but I've really thought about this week. What does this understanding do to our spiritual joy and vitality? It sucks it out. That's what it does. To our relationship with those who think differently than us, the unity in the church worldwide. Or you might go on in the next page, developing that same theme is, might not this notion that's so often central to church faith and practice be a prescription for sadness, for existential anxiety, for religious melancholy? What I'm thinking about is, 40 years ago, I'd be having these conversations with other good Christian friends, and what we'd be concerned about, Aunt Mary, not in our church, and what does that mean? Our sons and daughters, they're not sticking, it's not what my mom and dad believe, even in many cases. What about those people? And the anxiety that would go with that, and the need to do something, and then thinking any something we did wasn't really going to be appropriate either. So what are we going to do? And then what would go on is we'd start worrying about our own status. If we're not in the right church getting our doctrine exactly right, if you're one of those people who holds some minority doctrine in the Church of Christ, or you maybe make some mistake and maybe a major mistake in behavior, you're gone. And that's what this whole kind of thinking created. Sadness for existential anxiety just in the flow of life, and for religious melancholy, for perpetual concern for those closest to us who don't see things as we do, and perpetual concern that we too might be wrong, and wrong means lost. That was the point, and that's what we're working with today. Okay, what do we learn from history? And the issue here is how we define unity. That's the bottom line. It largely comes down to how we define unity and how unity is best defined. Well, in church at first, there was substantial diversity. And the quickest way I know how to describe that is that if you went from the church in Jerusalem to the church in Corinth, you would have culture shock. And right there in the pages of the New Testament, you'd see why. The way one church is described, the way the other church is described. They were almost they believe a few common things, and after that, they're just wildly different. But that's true all across Scripture, and it's very significant. The church at first had multiple perspectives. Now, I didn't know that until I more closely read Scripture, and then quit the hard work of trying to force square text into round holes. You know, and for my early ministry, that was my biggest mental challenge: is how to force this square text into a round hole. But yes, from the very beginning, there were multiple perspectives. The church of the 2nd century was incredibly diverse. And I could go into a survey of church history myself, but very, very quickly here. A lot of them were household gatherings. That made a huge difference. Among other things, what a household gathering did is the wealthy person in the church is a widow. A widow. She inherited her husband's wealth. She has the house. The church is meeting in that house. Guess what? She's kind of important to that church. No second-class citizenship for her. Not in the 2nd century. Then we get into all sorts of things that have often been dismissed as Gnostic ideas, and that was actually the nature of the Orthodox Church. When in the 4th and 5th century, it went back and looked at the wild diversity of the 2nd century. Everything that wasn't Orthodox is Gnostic. Well, that was a little peculiar. I don't know what you think of the word Gnostic. I mean, it just means out there ideas. People who claim to have special inside information is probably the quickest way to think of that. Some Gnostic ideas were really out there. You know, some weren't. They just weren't what the Orthodox Church settled on. And so they were dismissed as Gnostic. But there was enormous diversity in the 2nd century. And if the Emperor Constantine, and he was the first emperor to recognize the legitimacy of Christianity, if the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century tried to enforce uniformity, which he tried to do at the Council of Nicaea in 325, he substantially failed. He tried, he substantially failed. And I'll tell you how he failed. Because he basically died an Arian. An Arian was someone who took the view of Jesus as in some way subordinate to the Father, less than the Father. And there are many ways of defining it, but you know, the Trinity comes up with co-equal, co-substantial, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That was a philosophical construct trying to make sense of the New Testament evidence, but it didn't carry for a whole lot of people. And so there was this presbyter in Alexandria, Arius, for whom Jesus was great, most substantial teacher he'd ever met. He believed in the death, burial, and resurrection. He couldn't see how that made you co-equal with the Father. You know, a whole lot of people started to think from the same basis would probably agree with Arius. My point being, the Council of Nicaea established orthodoxy, but the emperor who tried to enforce orthodoxy didn't buy the package himself. As he neared death, he was an Arian. Now, there's questions about that. Scholars aren't quite sure of what he actually was, but we know what his son, the next emperor, Constantius, was. He was an avowed Arian. Okay, the point being that Constantine tries to enforce uniformity, but he substantially fails. And for over 1,000 years, the church saw itself as one, but there was a remarkable range of diversity in its doctrine, practice, and organization. And the clearest example I have of that is try to imagine historically a monastery in a valley in northern Italy or up in the Alps or in the hill country of England or France, anywhere. Imagine a monastery and imagine its linkage to other monasteries, how they're connected together. Now remember, we have ox carts, you know, and we don't have internet, you know. and people don't travel except for 1 in 10,000. Maybe a few more urchins. So the average person growing up in the village or being part of that monastery or abbey isn't going to go 10 miles beyond where they were born. And so the point is there was no way to enforce uniformity. In that world, you couldn't do it. And so for 500 or 600 years, if God had been wanting absolute uniformity, he set up a really crazy world to do it in. It just couldn't be done. And so the remarkable thing about that was the abbess in the monastery wasn't always an abbot. It was sometimes a female abbess. And the monastery had both men and women. The radical subordination of women was going to come later than that. In the first 1,000 years, there was substantial diversity. I won't go into that. That's maybe an intriguing sentence, but no surveys this morning, other than kind of what I'm doing. So there was, of course, an ever-present human tendency to wish that everyone might see things the way I do. Right? We all start with that. Boy, I wish wish Debbie saw it the way I did it, right? Okay, but that was impractical. And it always has been. So yes, the church was one, but it was a unity in diversity. Unity in diversity, not unity as uniformity. Those are the terms to catch here. You define unity as unity in diversity or as unity as uniformity. And that church in 1000 AD had no apparatus for structuring itself in any other way than unity in diversity. There was no way you could control. I mean, there was sort of a sense that the bishop in Rome was preeminent. I mean, he was called a pope, but that didn't really matter to anyone in England because Pope didn't know what you were doing in England. It'd be 3 years later, if you ever figured out what was going on. And he wasn't particularly trying. He was mainly concerned with inner city politics in Rome. That kept most bishops of Rome busy enough. Okay, so there was no apparatus for enforcing unity as uniformity until the 11th century, when the papacy, now armed with the tools of canon law and a near monopoly on education, sought to impose uniformity across Europe, an effort that reached its climax at the Fourth Lateran Council in Rome in 1215. So beginning around 1050, there's what medievalists understand to be a papal revolution. And Justinian law codes have been rediscovered. The value of law to structuring a society is now back in. There's increasing literacy among the top elite people, and the church now has the ability to, with that literacy, with monopoly in education, and with the tools of canon law, which the church is leading the legalization of Europe. Oh. At that point, the church seeks to impose uniformity across Europe. Reaches its climax at the Fourth Lateran Council. If you've been to Rome, the Vatican is the central place to visit the papacy, to see the glories, artistic glories of things. The Lateran Church, St. John Lateran, is the second church in Rome. It's still a significant church. It's worth, if you go to Rome, it's worth visiting that as well. So it's at this fourth council at the Lateran Papal Palace in Rome that under Pope Innocent III, who was a formidable man, a medieval monarch in the fullest sense of the word, and when his great council determined that only those whose faith and practice were identical with that of the church in Rome could be in fellowship with the church in Rome. See what he just said? So I don't care whether you're in southern France or whatever, you can only be in fellowship with the church in Rome. And we've got universities up in Paris now that can control you on that. We know whether you're doing the right thing or not. And only those groups, churches, monasteries, whose faith and practice were identical with that of the church in Rome could be in fellowship. Sound familiar? That's an idea that succeeded badly. I mean, with bad consequences, but it carried the day. You and I can only be in fellowship if we think essentially identically. That's what Scott.
I just want to interject here. This is why Europe is largely a non-religious continent.
You're wondering where the non-affiliates come from. Scott's exactly right. Okay, so he defines unity as uniformity, as close if not exact uniformity in doctrine and practice. And when 300 years later, the Protestant groups break off from Rome, guess which definition of unity they carried with them? Innocent III's. Unity as uniformity. Consequence over and over divisions. Okay, so saying a quick word as a restorationist. That ring a bell with most people. I'm a restorationist. You are too. You may not know that, but okay. Church of the Christ are historically part of a restoration movement, which not going into great detail on, was a back to the Bible movement in 19th century, very early 19th century America. And I'm still a restorationist. I'm just not sectarian or legalistic about it. What do I mean by that? I just figure we should all go back to our original text and see them again in their living historical context. That's restorationism too. It's really legitimate restorationism. And the way I figure it, I'm using these words advisedly, every good Catholic and every good Protestant is in some sense a restorationist too. And most of their scholars are. They want to go back to the original text and figure them out in their living historical context. For our purposes right now, here's why this matters. Maybe we have it backwards in how people come to faith. And I'll give you a quick clue and then we'll try to develop it. How did they do it with Jesus? When Jesus was on earth, how did people come to faith? After they passed an orthodoxy test somewhere. After they had certified good behavior. Like the original 12, remember that? So I have a friend who loves our church family, but he's not sure he believes everything we believe here. He's also not sure he's prepared to behave the way we all behave here, and I figure that's a good thing. But okay, ran that one right by okay, the attempt. But he figures he can't belong here until he gets his beliefs and behavior straightened out. And it's the way he was raised. It's the way most of us were raised, especially if we grew up in church, in any church. So for my friend, it's belief first, behavior second, and then belonging. And you think about it, and that's how historic Christianity is largely set up. You can't be a Christian in good standing if you don't have the core doctrine down. Maybe not every detail, but pretty close. You've got to believe the right things, first of all. Now, you're not a perfect person. You may slip up in behavior a little bit, but no big ones. No big ones. And, in our generation, we've got these two defining big ones in certain segments of the church that ignore all other kinds of misbehavior, but don't get those wrong. Now, every generation's done that kind of thinking because behavior becomes the next measure of it. And then if you get your beliefs and your behavior right, then you belong. Then you're recognized as in good standing. But what if belonging comes first and then changed behavior and then consequent beliefs? Now, I think almost as soon as you hear that idea, you say, yeah. Yeah, especially if you know the Gospels. You know, now, but having said that, for me, I learned that about 15 years ago from Diana Butler Bass's book, Christianity After Religion. But as soon as I read it in there, I went, oh, yeah. How did we miss that? So she goes back to the beginning, back to Jesus, and she asks, in what order did people come to Jesus? And to think about it, did Jesus go around and find some people who had their doctrine and behavior all squared away, and then allow them to belong? Appointed them apostles because their beliefs and their behavior were so exemplary. You know, read the Gospels again. Not Peter, not really any of them, not any of them. Or did he walk along the Sea of Galilee and invite first this fisherman and that one, and then a tax collector to follow me? Okay, so I am watching the clock and losing again. But if you were to turn to Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, you'd have a very good text of Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee and inviting first this fisherman and that fisherman to follow him. And do you remember the next line in every case? And they left everything and followed him. And then a little bit later in chapter 5, verses 27 to 32, he comes to Levi, the tax collector, and he calls him to follow him. And what does the text say? And he left everything and followed him. You know, left everything and followed him. And so that one of the questions that shows up at the end again, but I really hope you sort of take it into your heart today. Say, if we were to leave everything and follow Jesus, what would be the everything we would leave? You know, if we were to leave everything and follow Jesus, what would be the everything we would leave? And the first answer is going to be stuff. Because we are people of fairly limited imagination. And it would have to be stuff because that's how we evaluate everything. But I'm talking about ideas, values. Yeah, convictions, premises, bias.
Identity.
Yeah, those are the kinds of things you would, the notion that I have this doctrine figured out. I'm leaving that behind. I mean, now I do have a lot figured out about the doctrine. I've spent my whole life trying. But did I get it perfect? Of course not. I always still have a partial view of a key truth. It's about God. You know, how can my view be anything other than partial? How could your view be anything other than partial? And so maybe what we need to do is get along anyway. So we have all these partial views. And I'm not knocking the attempt to understand the ways of God. I'm just saying they're beyond me. You know, if you still think they're not beyond you, well, good luck. But I, you know, well, think about it. So I'm going to sort of run through some of this, but I think you've caught the point. That Jesus back at the beginning began simply with belonging. You got up and followed. Then what? You didn't sit around a fire and hear lectures on doctrine. You heard stories about how to behave. You know, and then from those stories about how to behave and following Jesus' example of how you treat people and so on, then from those stories and from the sense that we belong together as we learn this stuff, you know, that following from that, following from belonging in behaviors, it opened up for them a whole new vision of God, a whole new experience of God in this world. And so from belonging and behavior became beliefs and practices that made sense in the light of their newfound belonging and behavior. Does that make sense? Okay. In light, the premise is belonging. A group of people belong. You know, now I'm not talking about a legalistic kind of concept here. I'm talking about the spirit of the heart. You know, the spirit people belong. You know, we belong, but way more than us belong. You know, I'm talking about that spirit inside you that yearns for belongingness and then always blocks a bunch of people from belonging. And saying the first premise is get the belonging notions right. You know, and then behavior, how you treat people. And then in light of that, you come to the ideas, beliefs and practices that make sense in light of their newfound belonging and behavior. And in the box there, you'll see some broad notions of what apostles, a lot of this is Paul, what he eventually came to as he tried to get belonging and behavior straightened out. But consider the difference that now makes when you understand, when you, you know, I still have the same fundamental beliefs and practice that I did quite a few years ago. But I now understand them in light of belonging and behavior, and I'm going to frame them and interpret them and apply them in that light. And so, among other things, as you think about the consequences, here's a couple of quick things I would note. You will more quickly recognize that the ways of God turn out much more often to be great norms, bad law. You know, every great truth about God does not need to be turned into an iron cast law. It should be turned into a loving norm. The other thing, it's the same series we were just in with Chris. This is what we're talking about here is exactly centering and not treating things as boundaries. How do we understand a particular practice or a particular belief in a way that draws people together? In a way that draws people together and doesn't distinguish me from those people, or even make me think in terms of othering, which in June, Charles Ricks is going to come in and talk about. But we're talking about all the same thing because honestly, it's true. You know, that Jesus is into how did things come together. No, I won't go there. Enough trouble already. Okay. But okay. So, and all this is good news because, yeah, all this is good news because what people today seek is a place to belong. I always remember the theme song, and this ages me, but I always remember the theme song from the TV series Cheers. Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes you just want to go where everybody knows your name. They're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You want to be where everyone knows your name. That's the human need. That is the human need. That's what Jesus came to give us. I'm on page 4. Most of that you can read for yourself. What people need in terms of relationship and in terms of friendship. There will be a great coming spiritual awakening. I see it already happening. It begins as more and more people realize that we are called to belonging to God and to one another, to learning to behave in light of that belonging, and then learning and teaching those beliefs and practices that follow naturally from this new life transforming and life enhanced belonging and behavior. So the questions here at the end, and we have 3-4 minutes. I'll read them into the record, and then we have 2 minutes to respond to it. But what follows from all of this for the disagreements we naturally have about life and faith, even politics and God? Disagreements we inevitably have because we all have only partial understandings of truth. There's a question in our society: do you believe in absolute truth or not? I actually believe in absolute truth. I just don't think I have it. And it's as simple as that. I do believe in truth. I believe in truth with a capital T, as opposed to the relativism of our society, which is cynical and doesn't believe anything. And that ought to be the difference in here, that we actually do believe things, but we do it humbly and we do it provisionally. And we understand that we only have partial understandings of that truth, even of some of the simplest things we face. It's still a partial understanding. That's so obvious, it's there. Until you hear the other person's perspective. It's not so obvious. Okay. Consider the real life effectiveness of this order of belonging, behavior, and belief. Apply it. We're not just talking about the church. Apply it to America today. Apply it to being one nation together. Belonging first, behavior second, beliefs third. Okay, well, there's some core ideas that nations formed around, of course, and they're good ones. Okay, but belonging, what's been lost in this country? That we belong together. Whatever your education, whatever your ethnicity, whatever your political perspective, whatever, whatever ideology you sort of follow, we first belong together. And we learn good, mature adult behavior. We talk to one another and act like mature human beings. And then on that basis, we find out, wow, we agree on so much. Well, when you get the order right, that's what happens. Consider this, the effectiveness of this order in being one world together, not just America, but someone from the Philippines, Malaysia, whatever, the recognition that they belong with me. And whatever, and my behavior is going to have to be Christ-like behavior to them eventually, as I continue to try to mature. Okay, but then even a functioning workplace, right? It's always this principle. If a workplace is working, it's because a bunch of people really belong. And then they get their behavior right, and then they get their ideas squared away. Okay, okay. So I'm sorry about the timing. I think I can do better the next 2 weeks, and no promises on the third one. Interconnectivity is the fifth one. Interconnectivity is a big concept, okay, but it's important. It's going to be good that we get there. But take this question with you. If we were to leave everything and follow Jesus, what would be the everything we would leave? And it'd be a bunch of your ideas and how rigidly you hold them. That would be core. Now, some of those ideas, you're definitely going to hold. You're going to hold on to. But the rigidity, the fact that that idea is more important than that person beside you, wrong. It's not. It's the rigidity you leave behind. It's the love you reinsert. The importance of learning to live a life of love. That's essentially what we get back to from this class. Konya, if you could lead us in prayer.